Good afternoon. My name is Tyler Fedrizzi, and today I'm going to talk to you about the ethical considerations for the Boeing 737 MAX disaster. So, the Boeing 737 MAX is the next generation aircraft from Boeing. It was designed in Seattle, Washington, and had its first flight January 29th in 2016. Some of the features of the design of this system were that it had a bigger engine and a better aerodynamic profile, which gave it overall a better design. Now, one part of this aircraft, and something that was a little bit particular, is what's called the Maneuver Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS, and this is what's called an anti-stall device. Now, this is really what it's for, is when an aircraft is taking off or making a maneuver, it measures something called the angle of attack, which, as you can see from the diagram, is essentially how far up from horizontal the plane's nose is sticking. And that's very important because essentially, if that angle of attack is too great, then airflow cannot get into the engines. If airflow is lost in the engines, then there is no longer lift that can be created from the air going over the wing of the aircraft. This would eventually cause the plane to stall in midair and could potentially cause the system to crash. So, one particular thing about the Boeing aircraft was that there was first an accident with this aircraft about 2 years after it was launched. On October 29th, 2018, departing from Jakarta, Indonesia, a Boeing 737 MAX with 189 passengers on board crashed 12 minutes after flight, killing all on board. It wasn't immediately known what happened. There was some communication back and forth between the pilot and the air traffic controller, but it was still, the real reason wasn't really known. And then in March 10th of 2019, there was a Boeing 737 MAX that departed from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, with 157 passengers on board. And that crashed 6 minutes into flight, killing all on board. Now, initial reports were that the pilots were having a really hard time controlling the aircraft. And so after a very lengthy investigation, they were able to figure out what happened. So on board these aircraft, there is something called an angle of attack sensor, which is placed on the outside of the aircraft. This measures, like I mentioned before, that angle of attack, which is very important. Now, the first peculiar instance was that there was only one of these sensors on board, which is almost unheard of for aircraft systems. You usually have multiple sensors. They're redundant systems in case of these failures. The MCAS system was added to the Boeing 737 because the flight characteristics of this aircraft were subtly different from the previous generation, and that's very important for FAA certification. So, however, they knew that the MCAS system would almost never be used except whenever something would happen, particularly like a faulty AOA sensor. So, for that reason, Boeing never included the MCAS system in any of the training or in any of the flight manuals. As well, for certain airlines, you actually had to buy and pay for this indicator to show whether the system was working or not. And so for a lot of budget airlines, that was never even installed because the pilots had no idea the system existed. However, there were other reasons for this. There was also pilot inexperience. These pilots were generally new and didn't have a ton of experience, and they lacked something called airworthiness, which is essentially an intuition about how the aircraft is flying. There were also FAA regulatory failures, where Boeing and Boeing employees were actually given regulatory approval over certain engineering design decisions without the FAA ever knowing what was actually happening. So, some of the ethical considerations are that first, Boeing itself, right? They're a global company. They compete against 6 other manufacturers, and at the time they were competing against the Airbus A320neo in this specific 737 aircraft size. And that aircraft launched in June 14, 2014, so Boeing was really against the clock. They needed to get their new aircraft out the door as quickly as they can. However, it's now known that there were known defects about the MCAS system, and that their own engineers had serious reservations about the fact that only one sensor was being used in this MCAS system. There was also concern that the pilot training on the Boeing aircraft, that the MCAS system was never even mentioned. Furthermore, there were reports that there was a culture of conformity, and people were afraid that if they spoke out and they slowed down production, that potentially they could lose their jobs. And so Boeing acted, in my opinion, in a very unethical way that this happened. And so the ethical consideration here is that Boeing was really motivated by profit and getting a product out the door. However, there was also engineering design failure from Boeing itself. Now, the second consideration is the FAA. They have a type certification process. And so the reason the MCAS system was installed was to make sure that the flight characteristics weren't too different from the previous generation. This allowed the Boeing 737 MAX to have the same type certification as the previous generation, which means that pilots who fly these aircraft don't have to go and get retrained to fly this new aircraft. So that was very important for Boeing. But that's also a facet of FAA regulation, which says that you potentially can design an aircraft so that you don't have to you don't have to get the airplane certified at a different type. So this also caused problems because they then delegated their authority to company employees. And so there was a real lack of oversight and testing, where this regulatory agency, which is supposed to protect the American people and doesn't have a profit motive or anything else, was one of the reasons why this happened and why these failures occurred. Now, third, and this is incredibly important, are that the airlines themselves, the certification to become a commercial airline pilot is actually not that difficult. You don't need, the numbers there are the actual numbers that I got from the FAA website, and there's really, if you think about it, not that much experience you need to have. Furthermore, Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Airways are both budget airlines, so they pay less, and they usually expect the same performance or more performance from their pilots. And also, because of the cost of training, worst and edge case training is very rare, that these companies actually do that training for their pilots. Now, in my opinion, in this situation, there are honest and dishonest mistakes. A company, while it may be motivated for profit, doesn't mean that you can then put people's safety below that profit. Some of the dishonesty that occurred, however, was that Boeing, they had a lot of go-to-market pressure, and they ultimately decided to not listen to people who had concerns, and because of that culture of conformity, they never encouraged people to actually speak up about what was happening. There were engineering design decisions made that weren't properly looked over by the regulatory bodies, which caused essentially a catastrophic failure and cascading failure from the point of design until these systems were actually placed into operation. Furthermore, the airlines, because they push their pilots, have to also be held responsible for these actions. Now that I've told you my opinion, what's yours? Who do you feel is ultimately responsible for this? Is it the airlines? Is it Boeing? Is it the FAA? And what should their motives be? Profit, especially for a business, is going to continue to be a motive whether we like it or not. But how should a company or airlines or anyone place the motivation of profit, and where should that fall in terms of what they're concerned about? And then honest engineering error. How do we tell that it's honest? And then how do we say that we all have to take risks? Everything is really tolerances. Just unlike school, there's really no black and white. Sometimes things are 99% and you have to take that 1% risk. But how do we tell that, and then how do we deal with that? And then also, do you feel comfortable flying after given this information? Right? You know that these companies make these aircraft, but do you feel comfortable flying? And it's also a point that I think that these airlines and that these companies should make you feel comfortable. They should have better processes. You should know that they're going to be held responsible if something like this was to occur. So in summary, 376 people died, and we can't walk away from that. It was a serious tragedy that cost people their lives. Engineering design is so critically important. And more than that, we also have a responsibility to speak up when we see something that's wrong, regardless of whether it's in engineering or engineering design or in any walk of life. Profit cannot be the single motivation for design. We must make sure that we are always making the right system regardless of the cost. And also, regulators have to step up in the future and make sure that everyone is safe when we're flying on these aircraft. Thank you.